train races along the track as a blizzard howls outside. You shiver and grip your machine gun, squinting out into the darkness, trying vainly to see beyond the swirling snow. It's 1918 and you're a Czechoslovak Legionnaire, deep in the vast frozen wastes of Siberia, trying to escape from a land in chaos from revolution and civil war. Your home and family in Prague seem very far away. For now, home is an armoured train, bristling with turrets and machine guns, a self-contained world you must protect from a hostile population who are determined to destroy you. The train's shrill whistle bursts through the air, and the train starts to slow down. What now, you think? Word makes its way up the train. The track has been sabotaged. It has to be fixed before you can proceed. Your heart starts beating fast as you see shadowy figures moving in the darkness towards you. It's an ambush. The Reds are coming, you shout, as the gunshots start and the air is filled with lead. Your machine gun bursts into action as you return fire. You cannot lose this fight, or it will be a death sentence for all of you. Wave after wave of Russians charge the train. You can hear the bullets striking the armoured plate. Each time you repel them. Finally, the Reds break and flee into the snow. You keep firing until they vanish from view. Another victory for the Legion. But you can't relax. There's a track to fix, more fights ahead, and a lost army spread out across Siberia that needs to survive this frozen hell if you are finally going to make your way home. I'm your host James Barton, and this is Forgotten Wars.
Consequently, this country is at war with Germany.
Eagle 1, first strike, you have permission to engage the target.
First few hours after our servicemen went to the rescue of young Americans and of democracy in Grenada.
A lost army fighting their way across a frozen landscape in the midst of a revolution. Travelling on steampunk-like armoured trains on a mission to finally get home. Sounds like the plot of a sci-fi novel, yet it really happened. The Czechoslovak Legion was trapped in Russia as it collapsed into civil war. There was only one way to escape. They would have to fight their way across one of the most forbidding landscapes on Earth, the frozen wastes of Siberia. The Legion's 3-year journey would see them escape German plots, defy the might of the Red Army, become a leading faction in the Russian Civil War, and earn the admiration of the world. Their reward would be an independent Czechoslovakia. The epic journey has been overshadowed by World War I, but it's honestly one of the coolest stories I've ever come across in history. It deserves not to be forgotten. Just some quick admin. For brevity's sake, I'll be calling them the Czech Legion from now on, but be aware that it was made up of both Czechs and Slovaks. Let's set our scene. On the eve of the First World War, the countries we know as the modern Czech Republic and Slovakia had been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire under the Habsburg dynasty for over 300 years. Austro-Hungary wasn't really a nation, more of a vast multicultural hodgepodge of an empire that always seemed in danger of falling apart. The Germans and Hungarians dominated the empire, repressing the other nationalities to the Czechs and Slovaks. Inevitably, however, this bred resentment among its subject peoples and a growing desire for independence. During World War I, Allied promises of post-war independence led to the creation of an anti-Austro-Hungarian force called the Czech Legion, made up of former prisoners of war who pledged to fight for the Allies against their former rulers. It started off fairly small and wouldn't see action until late in the war. Ironically, it was the Russian Revolution in February 1917, the event that would cause them so much trouble later, which would give them an opportunity to finally take the fight to Austro-Hungary. There is a tendency to condense down the Russian Revolution in popular memory to the Tsar gets overthrown and then Russia immediately goes communist. Actually, it was more complicated than that. At first, after the downfall of the Tsar, there was a provisional government in place which tried to keep Russia in the war against the Central Powers. The Russian army, though, was beginning to collapse in the field as peasant soldiers deserted their units and headed home to their villages. Those that remained were unenthusiastic about continuing the fight. The new government was desperate for motivated troops and turned to the Czechs to help provide them. It was now that the legend of the Legion began to be created. The Russian Kerensky offensive in July 1917 was an absolute disaster, except for a heroic victory won by the Legion. Let's head to the town of Zaborov. As the Russian artillery pounds the Austrian trenches, you wait for your officers to signal the attack. You have a dangerous job ahead of you. As a shock trooper, you have to cut through the barbed wire of no man's land and then assault the trenches. But your morale is high. Today is the first small step in liberating your homeland. The whistle goes. It's time! The Austrian machine guns open up as you charge towards their trenches. You see the legionary in front of you collapse, clutching his chest. By luck or God's will, maybe both, you reach the barbed wire and start frantically cutting your way through. It's hard to concentrate as the bullets whiz around you, but finally the way has been cleared, and you leap into the Austrian trenches. A stunned Imperial officer looks at you open-mouthed, and then tries to raise his pistol. You are faster though, and as your rifle barks, he falls to the floor. With the officer down and more of your comrades storming the trenches, the Austrians' morale breaks and they start to flee. Your first battle is a victory for the Legion. Today Zaborov, tomorrow Prague. While the offensive itself was a failure, the victory at Zaborov became a huge propaganda victory. The surprising victory by the smaller Czech forces incited some Austrian politicians to demand an investigation of alleged Czech treason by units in the Austro-Hungarian army, ironically making the victorious legionaries famous across the empire. The provisional government, impressed by their abilities, allowed the Legion to recruit more Czechs and Slovaks from the prisoner of war camps. Soon their ranks had swelled to over 42,000 men. However, the offensive that had catapulted them into the spotlight now began to work against them. The failure of the Kerensky offensive fatally wounded the provisional government, and waiting in the wings to seize power was one Vladimir Lenin and his Communist Party, or Bolsheviks as they were known at this time. In November 1917, the Communists finally succeeded in overthrowing the government, taking power in Moscow and St. Petersburg. They immediately began negotiating with the Central Powers to exit the war. If the Legion wanted to carry on fighting, then they would have to head to the Western Front. Huge enemy armies blocked them from marching across Europe to France, while with the German Navy prowling European waters, steaming for France from Russian ports was far too risky. Ironically, if they were to get to the Western Front, they would have to head east. By crossing the frozen wastes of Siberia on the Trans-Siberian Railway to the Russian Pacific port of Vladivostok, then on to North America, a ship across the Atlantic, and finally to Western Europe. Before they could evacuate, though, the Germans struck. Fed up with the slow pace of negotiations, they launched a huge offensive called Operation Faustschlag, or Fist Punch. Its aims were to finally win the war on the Eastern Front, and secondary, to crush the Czech Legion before it could escape. The Russian army completely collapsed as the Germans made startling advances. As one German general wrote in his diary, "It is the most comical war I have ever known. We put a handful of infantrymen with machine guns and one gun onto a train, and rush them off to the next station. They take it, make prisoners of the Bolsheviks, pick up a few more troops, and so on. This proceeding has, at any rate, the charm of novelty." We say the Germans don't have a sense of humour. As the Russian army disintegrated around them, the Legion was in a bind. The Germans were heading towards a town called Backmark and its vital railroad junction. If they captured it, the Legion would be cut off from escaping east. Surrender wasn't an option, as the Austro-Hungarians pledged to hang them all as traitors. Just 2,500 Czechs held off over 6,000 Germans in an epic battle, buying time for the whole Legion to flee east. Having escaped the German frying pan, however, they found they had leapt into the Bolshevik fire. At first, they thought they had negotiated a deal with a communist leader to allow their evacuation. However, all was not as it seemed. Let's join some legionaries at the negotiations. "I don't trust these Reds, Tomas. They are not playing straight with us," you say as you both approach the local communist HQ. Your friend laughs. "Very bourgeois of you, Jacob, I'm sure. Anyway, we have no choice if we want to get to France. We have to hope they will hold up their end of the bargain." You grumble, but Tomas has a point. Still, as the slovenly peasant sentry glares at you before reluctantly letting you in and taking you to his commander, you expect a trap around every corner. This country has gone to hell. War, famine, and lawlessness are everywhere. The only order imposed at gunpoint by these Bolsheviks. Who are we meeting? One of those pretentious professor types bleating about Marx? No, this one's different. More a peasant. Not even Russian. A Georgian, I think. As you enter the room, you smell him before you see the official. He is smoking a pipe filled with a tobacco that scorches your lungs. He is all smiles under his bushy black moustache, yet his eyes fill you with unease. Cunning lurks there. Brutality, too, if you're not mistaken. He stretches out his hand. Welcome, comrades. I am Stalin. Joseph Stalin. Though he was still a second-rank Bolshevik leader at this time, with our foresight we know that any deal with the man of steel himself was likely to be broken. Sadly for the Legion, they would have to learn this for themselves. In April 1918, Russia was in complete chaos. Civil war had broken out between the communists and so-called white armies of former monarchists and anti-communists, while disaffected nationalists were trying to break free of the Russian Empire and declare independence. The Russian railway system was only working at a quarter of capacity, and rolling stock was scarce. The Legion would have to scrounge practically one rail car at a time before they could head off. Even worse, the rail lines were choked with traffic, travelling in the opposite direction. Mostly German and Austro-Hungarian prisoners freed, as the Bolsheviks had signed a peace treaty with the Central Powers. Still, despite these problems, slowly but surely, throughout the spring of 1918, hundreds of engines pulling thousands of cars took to the rails, each packed with Czech and Slovak troops. A key part of the Legion's story is that they were not travelling as one gigantic force. They were travelling in groups stretched out across the entire Russian railway network. By May 1918, some legionaries had reached Vladivostok, while others hadn't even left European Russia yet. To give you an idea of the vast distances they were dealing with, if you put a pin in New York and said this is where the easternmost units of the Legion were, then their comrades at the back of the convoy would be west of San Francisco, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The Legion's journey was already frustratingly slow, yet the communists seemed determined to make it even slower. Czech communists started appearing, calling on the legionaries to defect and fight for the Red Army, while local Bolshevik leaders constantly delayed them and tried to seize their weapons. The Czechs began to suspect the new communist government was deliberately sabotaging them at the request of the Germans. This was actually true. Tensions were rising on both sides. It would take just one spark for things to erupt into violence. That spark would be the German and Austro-Hungarian prisoners heading west. We're going to head to the city of Chelyabinsk, ground zero for what was about to happen. You're an officer in the Legion at Chelyabinsk, and your convoy has been stuck at this town for the last 2 weeks, despite fruitless arguments with the local commissars. Your men are frustrated and bored. They suspect a trick by the communists. It doesn't help that wave after wave of German and Austro-Hungarian soldiers are passing through as well. Just yesterday you barely stopped a fight as former German prisoners of war yelled, "Schweinhund!" and "Go back to your Englander masters!" You hope you're allowed to move on soon, or things are going to blow. Another train enters the station, heading west, as the passengers start to disembark. Oh no, what fresh trouble has arrived on the rails this time? You stiffen when you hear they are speaking Hungarian. Servants of the Empire, just what you didn't need. Many appear to be drunk. When they see your men, they know instantly who you are, and the insults start. "Traitors! Czech scum!" Your men stiffen and begin shouting back. This is going to get out of hand fast. You approach the officer and tell him to keep his men in line. He sneers back that he doesn't take orders from traitors. If he had his way, you'd all be hung from the nearest trees. You are struggling not to punch him when suddenly a vodka bottle flies through the air and just misses a legionary. There is silence for a minute, and then the station erupts into violence. Soon gunshots fill the air. There's nothing for it as you join the fray. It's time to show these lapdogs of the Emperor some Czechoslovak steel. After intense fighting, the Legion drove off the Hungarians. This may have remained a small incident in the wider bloodshed engulfing Russia, if the local commissars hadn't leapt on it as an excuse to imprison some of the Czechs, and then demand the rest to hand over their weapons. What happened next, though, would come to shake the new Bolshevik government to its very core. The revolt of the Czech Legion. The Czechs stormed Chelyabinsk station and freed their comrades, before taking control of the entire town. News of the Legion's siege of Chelyabinsk soon spread thanks to the telegraph wires that snaked along the Trans-Siberian Railway, making its way to Leon Trotsky. A legendary Bolshevik and right-hand man of Lenin, he'd recently been made commissar for the army and navy. Outraged, he demanded that the trains carrying the Czechs be halted. All members of the Legion must either join the new Red Army he was creating, or be drafted into labour battalions. When the Czechs refused, Trotsky sent a fatal telegram. All Soviets on the radios are obliged on pain of grave responsibility to disarm the Czechs. Each Czech found with arms on the railway line is to be shot on the spot. It would be one of Trotsky's biggest mistakes. All along the railway, the region rose up and attacked the Bolsheviks. While the Red Army was numerically stronger and better armed, the Legion was a veteran force, highly disciplined and much better motivated. In a matter of days, they scored huge successes, winning every battle they fought against the Red Army. Even worse, the communist troops abandoned vast stores of weapons and ammunition, and most famously armoured trains like the one we encountered at the start of this podcast. More on those soon, I promise. While most of the Trans-Siberian Railway was now in Czech hands, and they were much better armed, they were still in enemy territory, and a large majority of the Legion was still trapped at Penza far to the west. Their priority now was to rescue their stranded brothers and create a Legion-controlled safe zone stretching all the way to Vladivostok in the east. The Red Army tried to counterattack, sending 2,000 soldiers in an armoured train from Omsk to attack just 400 legionaries at Shelum. To make matters worse, the legionaries opposing them only had 40 rifles to defend themselves. Their only hope was to ambush the Russians. Let's join this famous battle. The wind chills you to the bone. Your tattered and mismatched clothes not really helping against the cold. You're part of an army, yet apart from the weapons you carry, it would be hard to guess. You've been conscripted by the communists, and now you are marching along a railway track to fight some Czechs. Well, it's not as if there's any other work around, you think. Behind you a train slowly trundles along, covered in armoured plate and machine guns sticking out of its turrets. Shots ring out, and the man next to you screams and falls to the floor. You dive to the floor, frantically looking for the enemy, but the long grass on either side of the train hides them. You're dropping like flies against this invisible enemy. Where is that train? Finally, your superweapon arrives, and its machine guns rake the long grass. The fight is turning in your favour as your officers organise the men to take the fight to the Czechs. Suddenly a shell strikes the train. Then a second. They have artillery? The train starts reversing, abandoning the troops to your fate. You frantically flee after the train as the Czechs begin emerging from either side of the railway and begin to give chase. Pursued by the Legion, the Russian commander frantically called Omsk for reinforcements. However, what he didn't know is the city had already fallen to the Czechs. Caught between these two forces, the Red Army troops surrendered. Similar victories occurred all along the Trans-Siberian Railway, with local whites and anti-communists joining forces with the Legion to fight the Bolsheviks. A good example of this period is what happened in Kurgan, a quiet town between Chelyabinsk and Omsk. According to anti-Bolshevik activist account after the Civil War, the Czechs arrived by train. Tall, young, and handsome soldiers appeared in the streets, dressed with red and white ribbons on their caps. They presented a sharp contrast with the Soviet security troops, who were dressed in shabby, dirty uniforms. Joining forces with a local group of 120 men, opposed to the Bolsheviks, they stormed the Red Army's positions in the city. The soldiers put up little resistance, except those who were guarding prisoners, fearful of retaliation for previous atrocities. By the end of July 1918, most of Siberia was in Czech hands, and into this political vacuum the Legion's victories had created stepped the anti-communist White Russians, who would set up their own diverse governments in alliance with the Czechs. These included the Kumach of the Social Revolutionaries, moderate leftists who had been betrayed by the Bolsheviks and the Provisional Siberian government in Omsk, which was more conservative and leaned monarchist. It was also in this period that the Czechs created their famous armoured train, the Orlik, or the Little Eagle, that we met at the start of this podcast. As Russia's roads were so bad and the country so vast, the Tsarist government had relied heavily on trains for transport, and later as armoured mobile weapons platforms for World War I. The Czechs combined many of the armoured sections they had captured into one makeshift train that became their superweapon on the Trans-Siberian Railway. Heavily armoured, bristling with machine guns, and bookended by 2 cannons, it would serve the Legion well throughout their time in Russia. Like most of the trains used by the Czechs at this period, it became its own self-contained world. Bakeries and kitchens were set up on the train. It was decorated with images of homes such as Prague Castle, and it even had its own newspaper that came out weekly. I'll put some photos up on the Facebook page and in our video on YouTube. The Legion's stunning successes soon got out to the world and greatly impressed the Allies. They were seen as a possible way to reopen an eastern front against the Germans. It's easy to forget that World War I was still raging while all this was going on, and also as a useful tool to fight the Bolsheviks. Waxing lyrical, Winston Churchill, then serving in Prime Minister David Lloyd George's cabinet, said, "The pages of history recall scarcely any parallel episode at once so romantic in character and so extensive in scale. Thus, through a treacherous breach of faith, by a series of accidents and chances which no one in the world had foreseen, the whole of Russia from the Volga River to the Pacific Ocean, a region almost as large as the continent of Africa, has passed as if by magic into the control of the Allies." While Lloyd George and Churchill disagreed about many things, they agreed about this. Lloyd George wrote, "The story of the adventures and triumphs of this small army is, indeed, one of the great epics of history." Former US President Teddy Roosevelt, long out of office and grieving over the death of his own son in the war, was nonetheless inspired by the reports of Legion's achievements in Russia. He donated the $1,000 of the cash award he received from his 1906 Nobel Peace Prize to the legionaries, quoting, "The extraordinary nature of whose great and heroic feat is literally unparalleled, so far as I know, in ancient or modern warfare." Even his mortal enemy, US President Woodrow Wilson, would agree with him. Probably the only thing they agreed on. He authorised an American expeditionary force to advance to Vladivostok, where it would combine with British, French, Italian and a huge Japanese force to save the Legion and to get them home. When the Allied forces arrived in Vladivostok, they found the Czechs had already driven out the Red Army and were waiting for them. The Allies took control of the port, claiming the vast munition supplies there were under threat from German prisoners of war. This was a massive lie, as there were none around the city. It was solely directed against the communists. There remained a final piece of the railway that was still held by the Red Army in eastern Siberia, around the great city of Irkutsk, on the shores of the vast Lake Baikal. As the Legion approached, it was here that the most unlikely victory in their history occurred. The Red Army operated a naval squadron on the lake that Czechs feared could be used to outflank them. They hit upon an ingenious solution to this problem, leading to the first, and only, naval battle for landlocked Czechoslovakia. Having seized 2 enemy steamships, they converted them into makeshift warships with artillery guns grafted onto them, effectively creating their own small fleet. Now, let's head to the Battle of Lake Baikal. As you sail through the heavy fog that blankets Lake Baikal, you can't help but think this is a desperate plan. You're soldiers, not sailors. Still, there's no time to turn back now. Up ahead you can see the outlines of the communist-held port of Boyosk. You tense up, waiting for them to open fire, but nothing happens. Looks like your luck is holding. They think you're a friendly force, especially with this fog. This is going to be a complete surprise for the Reds. Your artillery guns start firing on the SS Baikal, the main threat to the Legion. Shells smash into the ship and fires break out. There is pandemonium as you open up with your machine gun and rifles against the targets on the port. The Reds try to fight back, but they are on the back foot and are struggling to organise themselves. Suddenly a huge boom comes from the SS Baikal as an explosion rips through its hold. It starts to list as sailors dive over the side. Target destroyed. Your naval guns turn their attention to the train station and soon it is ablaze as well, while Red Army soldiers and sailors are fleeing from the port. Then you see the reinforcements arriving, an armoured train with artillery. Time to leave, you think, as the train stops and Soviets leap off and start getting the artillery in range to hit your ship. As you sail off into the sunset, you think, this sailing lark isn't so hard after all. That is how the landlocked Czechs won their first and only naval battle. 100% success rate even the Royal Navy and the US Navy can't boast of. Irkutsk soon fell after the Battle of Lake Baikal. The Legion was riding high and undefeated as they had turned their attention to western Siberia and the communist strongholds there. Abroad, their successes had impressed the Allies, and one by one they started officially recognizing that an independent Czechoslovakia should be created after the war. While the Czechs were going from strength to strength, the Bolshevik government was in chaos. Speaking to an extraordinary joint session of Soviet leaders on July 28th, Lenin urged upon them the necessity of crushing the Czech Slovaks and their counter-revolutionary partisans on the Volga, in the Urals, and in Siberia. This is the most urgent task of the Russian Revolution, and all other tasks must be relegated to the background for the present. To the same group the next day, Trotsky conceded, "What is happening now on the Volga, in the shape of the Czechoslovak mutiny, puts Soviet Russia in danger, and therefore also endangers the international revolution." The same group the next day, Trotsky conceded, "What is happening now on the Volga, in the shape of the Czechoslovak mutiny, puts Soviet Russia in danger, and therefore also endangers the international revolution." It seems almost incomprehensible that some Czechoslovak corpse, which has found itself here in Russia through the tortuous ways of the World War, should at the given moment prove to be almost the chief factor in deciding the questions of the Russian Revolution. Nevertheless, that is the case. Fatefully, the Legion was approaching Yekaterinburg, the city where the deposed Russian royal family was being held. Fearful that the Czechs would free the Russian royals, Lenin ordered that they were to be killed. To avoid being blamed himself, he made sure that the order was blamed on the local Ural Soviet leaders instead. The Soviet Union would insist on this version of events until it collapsed in 1991, and the records revealed the truth. The former Tsar and his family would be murdered in the basement of the house serving as their prison. Continuing their run of successes, the Legion next took Kazan and discovered a priceless treasure there, the Imperial Gold Reserves. Imperial Russia had some of the largest gold reserves in the world. When World War I had started, they had moved the gold to Siberia for safety. Now this vast treasure was in the hands of the Czechs. It would have a very interesting history while in their care, leading to a great mystery that still hasn't been solved. The Legion was riding high, but it's after Kazan that things began to go wrong. Their biggest problem was with their allies, the White Russians, and in particular a rapidly rising figure in their ranks in the shape of Admiral Alexander Kolchak. Kolchak was one of the oddest of the White Russian leaders during the Civil War, and that is really saying something. An imposing man with hard, staring eyes. One British officer described him as a big, sick child, an indubitable neurotic who quickly flares up, exceedingly impetuous and uncontrolled in expressions of displeasure and anger. While many saw him as the man who could lead the Whites to victory, he was an appalling administrator and fatally bad with managing people. A passionate Russian nationalist with a seeming distaste for all foreigners, Kolchak took against the Czech Legion from the beginning. Despite arriving in Omsk in a Czech-controlled train, he was soon insulting the Legion and picking fights with them. He ranted that organized traffic was harmed by the interference of Czech trains in the operation of the railways. The Czechs have demanded that only their trains should be allowed through. If the situation continues, it will lead to a complete halt of Russian trains. If this happens, I will reserve the right to take extreme measures. Though mere bluster at this stage, in the middle of a civil war that was in the balance, he was insulting the force that had made White Russian control of Siberia possible. In November, he would launch a coup against the Omsk government, becoming a military dictator, further undermining Czech support for the White Russian cause. Combined with a breakdown in relations with the White Russians, Czech morale was further hurt by the establishment of an independent Czechoslovakia and the end of World War I. They'd achieved their dream. Now the legionaries just wanted to get home to their new state. However, they were still strung out over Siberia, a civil war was still raging, and Kolchak was making threats, and the Allies were still plotting how they could be used to defeat the Bolsheviks. It was not over yet by a long shot. To the east, the Bolsheviks were finally getting organized. The Red Army was becoming a force now worthy of its name, thanks to the organizing genius of Trotsky. They counterattacked, and even the Czech Legion was unable to stop the defeat of the Whites as they started their slow retreat across Siberia. Kolchak once again blamed everything on the Czech Legion, ignoring the vast deficiencies in his own government and army. The Legion would be relegated to guarding the Trans-Siberian Railway and the huge gold reserves it has seized. This would not be an easy job, however. Kolchak's government was highly corrupt, while cocaine, caviar and champagne were plentiful for white officers. Food and other basic essentials were incredibly scarce for the population of Siberia. What little was available was hoarded by Kolchak cronies, who then sold them on for huge markups on the black market. His Cossack brigades were particularly badly behaved, entering villages controlled by the whites and raping and pillaging at will, while charging tolls on any local merchants. As you can probably guess, this behaviour hardly earned the whites the loyalty of their subjects. Kolchak further made a bad situation worse for his own stubbornness. He refused to endorse land reform, a key demand of local peasants. In fact, he refused to make even the most minor of reforms that his advisers begged him to try to win the loyalty of his subjects. Inevitably, this led to a brutal communist guerrilla insurgency gaining steam behind white lines. Its primary target would be cutting the Trans-Siberian Railway, leading to the battles such as the one I described at the start of this podcast. Throughout 1919, the White Army was pushed back across Siberia, while the Legion frantically tried to get their men to Vladivostok amid the chaos of the retreat. All the while, Kolchak blamed them for every defeat, raging and ranting to the Allied forces commanders and even his own henchmen. He seemed more obsessed with the Legion than the Red Army, that by then had even taken his former capital of Omsk. He was increasingly isolated, having not only pushed away the Legion, but the Allied forces and many of his own officers as well, by his temper tantrums and trying to pass the buck. In the chaos that was engulfing white-controlled Siberia, the train carrying Kolchak approached the town of Nezhudinsk, but was cut off by an unexpected red advance. His own bodyguards deserted him, and he was forced to step down as political and military leader of white-ruled Siberia by the Allies. He was now at the mercy of the local Czech legionaries. He had been promised safe passage out of Russia, but the Legion faced increasing resistance from Red partisans as they made their way to Vladivostok. Then, a deal was offered to them by the very communists they'd been fighting. Imagine this. You're a bodyguard for a legionary general, heading to a secret meeting with the Red Army. You are nervous of betrayal, but the general seems confident that he holds enough cards to keep the Reds in line. As the train you are travelling on stops, you wait for the Reds to appear. They stride in with the confidence of those who believe they are on the winning side. Sadly, they are. Greetings, General, to you and your associates. I bring a message from Comrade Lenin. He sends praise for your men's gallantry and bravery in this war. It is wasted on the reactionary landowners and capitalists of the White Army. Your face is impassive, but inside you laugh at the obvious flattery. The discussion is short and sweet. The Soviets make their offer. We are prepared to give you passage to Vladivostok and let you leave this land. In return, we have two conditions. Give us the gold that you stole from Kazan. It belongs to the people of Russia. Secondly, we want Kolchak. You expect them to demand the gold, but Kolchak takes you by surprise. You wonder if the general will agree. He's quiet for a minute, mulling his options, and then he speaks. Agreed. With the permission of the Allies, the Czechs controversially betrayed Kolchak, handing him over to the communist partisans. Despite the arrival of an order from Moscow to keep him alive, after a brief interrogation he was executed by firing squad. Unlike his time as leader of the Whites, he is said to have met his end calm and unafraid. An eyewitness claimed, "He died like an Englishman," seemingly the ultimate compliment he could come up with. His body was dumped under the ice of the frozen Angara River and was never recovered. Those historians who have written about the Legion often condemn them for this. However, Kolchak had done little to nothing to ingratiate himself with the Legion. I find it personally hard to condemn them for looking out for themselves as Kolchak's regime collapsed around him. The communists kept their word, and by March 1920, 60,000 Legion soldiers, officers and civilian refugees had shipped out of Vladivostok and were heading on their long journey home to their new country of Czechoslovakia. Theirs had been an epic journey from the battlefields of Ukraine. They had travelled across a Russia consumed by civil war and safely made it back home. A truly amazing achievement that can only really be compared to the journey of the 10,000 back in ancient Greek times, when 10,000 Greek mercenaries trekked their way across a hostile Persia, all to get home to Greece. Sadly for the Czechs, it had been at a cost. More than 4,000 of their comrades had died during their trek and been left behind in the snows. The legionaries would arrive to a hero's welcome in their new nation. Their battle-hardened ranks would make up the core of the new Czechoslovak army. When Hitler dismembered their nation, they would make up the majority of those who would fight on for Czech freedom in other countries, or would help lead the resistance to Nazi occupation. After the Second World War, when the Communists seized power in 1948, they tried to ignore the legacy of the Legion. They were seen as counter-revolutionaries, and also the Czech leaders wanted to curry favour with their Soviet masters. However, when the communist regime fell and democracy returned, in both the Czech Republic and in Slovakia, the Legion returned to favour. There's not a town in either country that does not have a street named after one of the famous legionaries. In fact, in both the Czech Republic and in Slovakia, a hardcore of volunteers now regularly recreate the Czech Legion wearing their uniforms, and they even have their own train carriages where they show how the Legion used to live as they travelled through Russia. I'm going to include some photos of that on our Facebook page and also in the YouTube video that will accompany this. Many legends also began about the Legion, none more mysterious than what happened to the gold they had supposedly handed over to the communist partisans. Large portions of it were never recovered, with conspiracy theories about theft or it being dumped into Lake Baikal. However, there is another theory that the Legion kept one of the 8 railway wagons of gold and brought it back home. There is some evidence for this. Surviving telegrams mention the Legion moving gold. Also, the Legion set up a cooperative bank while in Russia called the Bank of the Czechoslovak Legions, often shortened down to Legio Bank. When they returned home, the bank moved to Prague and became a major financial force in the young country, with suspiciously high gold reserves. It was heavily associated with the legionaries, and the outside of its office was covered in a mural depicting the heroism of the Legion. If you visit Prague, I highly recommend you go and see it. It's a beautiful building. It remains a mystery, but as one Czech historian said, nowadays we can read in many Russian newspapers that this gold was stolen by Czechoslovakia. To tell the truth, there's no evidence it was so. On the other hand, no one can argue it was not. The Soviets certainly believed it was true. At the end of World War II, they confiscated what was left of the Czechoslovak gold reserves as reparations for the supposedly stolen gold. I think I will leave the last word on the Legion to Legionary Gustav Bekva. On the 20th of June, 1920, we crossed the frontier of our newly freed homeland, the Czechoslovak Republic. Here, after 6.5 years of weary exile, I saw my mother again. If you like the podcast, please subscribe, leave a rating, or tell a friend. We're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and now on YouTube as well. For our next war, I'll be doing my first multi-part series covering the Spanish-American War. See you next time for more Forgotten Wars.